In this video, I'm going to show you how to change the sealed bearings in a Stan's hub. We'll be working on the rear hub for this video. This process should work for most bicycle hubs that have sealed bearings. What you'll need to do this is a bearing press. I've got one from Wheels Manufacturing. It comes with the press and it comes with a whole bunch of adapters to press the bearings in. We'll also need a punch. You can use a flat blade screwdriver. I like using a punch because a flat blade screwdriver, you have to be super careful that you don't scratch the inside of the hub. And that's really all you need, other than a little bit of grease to put inside the race before you press the bearings back in. So what we're going to do is we're first going to remove the rotor. You do not want to damage the rotor when you do this. This is a Shimano center lock, so it's just got one lock ring there. It may be a 6-bolt rotor where you have to take the 6 Allen bolt or Torx bolts out. So let's go ahead and do that first. I love Shimano center lock. I did loosen that with the rim on the ground on a mat. So that's all you have to do for a Shimano center lock rotor. I also love how easy it is to work on Stan's hub. So we're just going to pull off this end cap, and then we're going to pull off the free hub. There is a little spacer inside there. You want to pull that out as well. That is crucial for putting the free hub back on. Can't really get that with my fingers, so I'm just going to get a little screwdriver and pick that out. Do a little pick and pick that out. So yeah, it's just a tiny little spacer. Remember to put that back on, otherwise the free hub won't spin. So it's just a tiny little spacer. And then on the other side, we're going to remove this end cap. And the axle may pull out with it, which is what you want. So there we go. Let's keep the end cap on there. Okay, so there's the bearing on one side, and you've got a bearing on the other side as well. We're going to go ahead and remove this little cover here, and I'm going to use a flat blade screwdriver, a little tiny one here. I'm just going to pick off this little cover there. So in between the bearings is a little sleeve. Now, until I push on it, it looks like it's hollow all the way through, but there is a little sleeve that you can either push with your fingers or put a screwdriver in there and push it down. And what that does is it gets it out of the way so that you can put a punch through and tap out one of the bearings. So I'm going to take my punch actually and just see if I can push that down. There we go. Okay, now you can see that sleeve moved out of the way. That will allow me to put the punch through, and I can just use a hammer and tap out the bearing on the other side. Then we'll take that sleeve out and tap out this bearing. So with the wheel leaning up against something, I can just put my punch in there and then just tap. And what you can do is you can actually move the wheel, because once you start to get it moving, that sleeve is going to move around in there real easily. And you can tap, kind of go around the bearing. That's coming out pretty easily actually. Looks like the top part, I just got to tap on that and should be out. There we go. One more tap should get it. There we go. So the bearing came out, and then also the sleeve came out. Okay, so you got to remember to put that back in before you press in the other bearing, or when we press both of them back in. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to do the same thing for the other bearing. The sleeve's out of the way, so I can just go around and tap on that bearing and get it out. So I got both bearings out. The cover came off this one when I was tapping it out. The first one that I took out still spins very easily. This one is totally seized up. I don't know what happened to this one, but it is done. So that's why I'm changing these out. Now it's time to press the new ones in. Before I press in the new bearings, I'm just going to spray some rubbing alcohol on a paper towel and just clean the inside really well. It's not very often you have access like this to your hub. So you just want to clean out the inside. And then we're going to put a very light coating of grease inside so that the bearing will press in easily. So I'll start by pressing in the bearing on this side, and I'm just going to put in a little bit of grease, and then I'll use the bearing press to press in the new bearing. I'm going to show you how all of these pieces work that come in a bearing press like the Wheels Manufacturing, and I'm actually inserting this scene after I had finished the video because I realized I didn't do that, and it's pretty important. So again, you've got all these pieces. We're going to use 5 pieces for this job, and also the axle and of course the handle. So I've got my bearing, and what you want to do is you want to find 2 pieces that fit perfectly inside the bearing, and I'm going to demonstrate how you would do this on a hub. So I've got that piece there and that piece there that fit perfectly inside of these bearings, because the goal is to keep this axle as centered as you possibly can. If you don't, if it's off-centered, it's not going to press the bearing in straight, and you may have to tap out the bearing, and if you do that, you risk damaging the bearings. As long as you keep this axle perfectly centered, the bearings are going to go in really easily. I'll show you what I mean on a wheel that already has the bearings pressed in. This is a different wheel than the one I was working on in the video, but I want to show you how these pieces work. So we're going to press in the bearing on the non-drive side first, and I'll show you why here in a second. And this is the way you're going to have the bearing press set up for the first bearing. And then we're going to use a large piece that goes in where the free hub would go. That's why you want to do the non-drive side first, so you can use this piece on the other side to keep the axle perfectly centered. So you need to use this extension, because if not, the handle is going to hit the outside of the hub as the bearing goes inside. So pressing in the non-drive side first, we would have this extension, the piece that goes in the bearing, and then the bearing. And then on the drive side, we can use this fat piece that's going to go down inside where the free hub is, and then we'll probably need to use an extension here, and then we'll just tighten the bearing press in the non-drive side bearing, and then we'll press in the second bearing, and I'll show you how the setup would be for the second bearing. This would be the setup for the second bearing. So I've already got the bearing installed on the non-drive side, so we just have that piece to go inside the bearing. We've got the extension so the handle doesn't hit, and then on the drive side, the second bearing that we're pressing in, obviously the bearing's already in there because this wheel set already has the bearings installed, but you got that piece that would go perfectly inside the bearing, and then you would have the extension so the handle doesn't hit. So let me get that in there so you can see that goes inside the bearing. We would just tighten it down, and then you would press in the second bearing. So again, just wanted to show you that because it's really important how you have these pieces set up, and so I'll pick up the video working on the wheel that I was installing the bearings on. Okay, so I'm just going to turn this and press in that bearing. This one, the original ones had the gray side out, so I'm making sure I continue with that. And by the way, you do want to press in one at a time, and you do not want to over tighten this. So this is going to be snug without being over tightened. So that was really simple. We'll do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to make sure I put the sleeve back in before I press in the bearing. Now we're just going to put everything back together. So I'm going to put in this little rubber seal that I've already cleaned off. And then I'm going to slide the axle through. And I'm going to slide it through from the other side. So I'm going to work on the side with the free hub. So I'll push that through. I'm going to put a little bit of grease on that axle. So just a little lithium grease. Slide that axle back through. And then we'll press on the free hub. And we pretty much will be done. A couple tips when putting the axle back through. Make sure that sleeve that's inside is perfectly lined up with the bearings. Also, because these are new bearings, they were pretty tight, and I actually had to use a little soft mallet to tap it through. Like I said, making sure that sleeve is straight first. And now we're going to put on the free hub. So I'm going to put on this little tiny spacer. Do not forget that. And then I'll slide on the free hub. Actually, before I do, I haven't cleaned this yet. I'm going to clean off the free hub and then put some grease on it before I push it back on to the hub. Now it's time to put the free hub back on. And by the way, the bearings in this free hub are very, very smooth. You want to check those because it's the same process. You've got a sleeve inside, you've got a bearing on each side. So, you know, you may need to change the bearings there too. Since this also has a sleeve, you got to make sure that's straight before you can slide it back on. And then, so again, I've got that little spacer in there. And then I'm just going to slide the free hub onto the axle. And that sleeve is moving around a little bit. So let's make sure that's straight. There we go. And then you may have to push in some of these pawls with your fingers and then rotate it counterclockwise as you do. And then the last step is to just put back on the end cap onto the axle. And wrapping up the video a few days later in my studio because someone came into the garage when I was trying to finish the job. But that's how you install bearings in a stance hub, and the process should be very similar to other hub brands that use sealed bearings. Now I will say it's been a while since I bought one of the Wheels Manufacturing bearing press kits for hubs. They're not cheap. I'll drop a link in the description below in case you want to pick one up. So make sure if you do, that you charge your friends for installing their bearings as well. You know, you install new bearings when your current ones just don't feel buttery smooth. And as you saw in the video, it's not that complicated. I mean, really, you know, pull off the cassette and rotor, you tap out the old bearings, press in the new ones, and the whole job takes 15, 20 minutes. And so it's something that, again, you should do when the bearings don't feel totally smooth. So any questions or comments, drop those below. Thanks for watching.